Okay, I'm here today to talk about SSL interception in a way that I believe it could be resisted, if not prevented, with some technologies that are readily available to us that are being underused. I'm Jacob Thompson from Independent Security Evaluators. This is an appropriate room to be giving this talk because our office is about a half a mile away from the Pimlico racetrack, so that's appropriate. So here are some things I'm going to go over. How SSL works in normal operation when nobody's attempting any kind of interception attack. The different kinds of SSL interception that are prevalent today, and why personally I worry that it's only going to get worse in the future. The types of mitigations that are being put in place so far by other entities such as Google, and how they are and are not effective, and how we could do better, and how client certificates could be put in place to resist this type of attack. And an example. So this is how SSL works normally. Your client connects to the server presents a certificate. That certificate has been signed by a trusted certificate authority, and the only definition of a trusted certificate authority is one that is in your browser's list of those authorities. So in other words, it's up to the makers of your browser or operating system to determine whether or not a certificate authority is trustworthy. When a conventional SSL is in use, the reason that man in the middle is not possible is that the man in the middle cannot convince a certificate authority to sign a certificate and pose as the identity of a server according to an authority that your browser trusts. So this is how SSL is supposed to prevent attack. Increasingly on many enterprise networks, SSL interception has been put in place intentionally. And the way that operates is they become their own certificate authority. Now that doesn't work because your browser only has a list of specific authorities that it trusts. So what do? On all of their corporate desktops, laptops, potentially mobile devices, they use some type of provisioning to load this custom certificate authority into your browser's trusted list. Or in otherwise, your browser has been manually configured to trust a certificate authority that in reality is just creating phony certificates. But because that certificate authority is in your list, everything works as well. This is usually called data loss prevention, SSL inspection, content inspection, or so on. And it's only getting worse. Personally, I think it presents a privacy issue. There could be both sides of the issue. On a corporate network, you could argue this is just a security device. But this is what else is happening, is that certificate authorities, in some cases, are either willingly or unwillingly assisting in this process of doing an interception attack. One example from about 2 years ago was TrustWave. TrustWave came forward with some kind of press release or disclosure that they had assisted a company in deploying an SSL interception device with a real certificate authority in it. And their case was specifically dramatic because this was something TrustWave was 100% okay with. And their reason for doing it is they said, well, there's no way to extract these certificates and private keys out of this device, so it's not that bad. It's just a security device. It could also be done without the cooperation of the certificate authority, but with the same consequences. Many large enterprises that need large numbers of security certificates don't get them in the same way as an individual like one of us would do. Rather than having to submit a CSR to the certificate authority one by one for each server, manage them all one by one, pay for them all one by one, the certificate authority just says, okay, you're a big enough, trustworthy business, you have insurance, we're going to lend you a private key and certificate that chains to our root, and you have to promise only to use it for domains that you actually own. So be trustworthy. In reality, there have been 2 examples in just the past year where a business has said, hey, we have this sub-CA, we want to do SSL inspection to protect our network. This is a big pain having to load these custom root certificates on all our devices. Why don't we just load this right into the device? One of those examples was Turk Trust, and another one was ANSSI, which is a French government certificate authority. Those have both been in the news recently with very similar results. So this gives you the question, if the browser vendors are responsible for determining whether a certificate authority is trustworthy or not, what do they do when this happens? Nothing, right? All three of these certificate authorities are still in that list of trusted CAs that your browser or operating system provides you. Now, that's not to say that they're doing absolutely nothing. There are some processes they put in place to try and say never again. One of those that Mozilla specifically is doing is they're reviewing their entire list of CAs in their program, and they're saying one by one, okay, really? No, you need to say to everybody that has one of these sub-CAs, you're not allowed to do SSL interception. You're only allowed to sign certificates for domains that you own and control. That is just a legal and contractual constraint. There's no real proactive enforcement mechanism. Instead, they have to be caught. The second is a technical constraint, which is called name constraints. And this basically says, instead of there just being a certificate authority, carte blanche, instead the CA certificate can have a field in it saying only subdomains of these domain names are actually in scope for this CA and can be signed. So are these complete solutions? I would say no, because in your browser right now, there are certificate authorities that are valid for 20 or 30 years. It's not going to go away anytime soon. So what is being done technically to try and frustrate interception using real certificates, which I think is a big problem? Well, one of them, Google, is on the forefront of trying to do something about this, and Firefox has just joined this recently, is certificate pinning. In other words, your browser has a list of specific high-profile websites when you install your browser with the legitimate certificate or the legitimate CAs for those domains. As you browse the internet, if the browser detects a certificate that doesn't match this pinned list, it calls home to Google and says, hey, I saw this certificate in the wild, why don't you do something about it? In fact, that's how the Turk Trust and ANSSI incidents were both discovered. They were not, unlike the Trust Wave, they were not something that the CA came forward and said, we're not going to do this anymore. They were actually had to be caught. Another method is that the Google search engine, as it crawls the internet, it keeps track of the zoo of certificate authorities that it sees. The EFF is also doing some projects, the SSL Observatory, to try and keep track of who actually owns one of these sub-CAs, who's capable of doing this attack. And there's basically a big list of corporate America that has one of these enterprise CAs. Another increasingly relevant mitigation is those companies that are making a native mobile application is far different from a web application because you have control of the client side of the SSL library. You can leave the conventional CA system altogether, run your own CA, distribute a mobile application that reconfigures the SSL library to use this store of trusted CAs before making a connection instead of the system default. But one thing that these all have in common is that they are all done from the client side. The server is oblivious to whether SSL interception is in place, and depending on how it's implemented, the user could always click through a bunch of warnings to continue to connect anyway. So here's a solution, is mutual authentication. Give clients certificates as well as servers. Now, is to get a server certificate, why would you ever want to do that for the client as well? Well, I'm not proposing to do that. Instead, we're just going to have the server run its own certificate authority and issue certificates for no purpose whatsoever other than to resist this type of interception attack. So this is not a true PKI system. There's no identity verification in reality. And in fact, you could implement it just like this, where the server blindly issues certificates to the client, and you've accomplished two things. One is that as long as the first connection to the server is not being intercepted, and you issue the certificate without the certificate request being fraudulent, you're secure for subsequent connections. This should sound familiar. SSH, right? The second is that you've changed the problem from impersonating the server to requiring the interception device to fraudulently submit a client certificate request and obtain this client certificate, and then impersonate the server down to the client to do the same things that the client thinks they have a real certificate. This is much more difficult and error prone than just doing the certificate. The reason that interception doesn't work in this case is that the server's list of trusted certificate authorities for client certificates is going to be itself, and no matter what this interception device in the middle does, it cannot create a certificate that is signed by that certificate authority without convincing the server to sign one. Even if the certificate authority for the server certificate is compromised, you have the same issue. You have to fraudulently obtain a certificate from the server. So rather than just blindly signing the client certificate, which is somewhat equivalent to SSH, can we do something that's somewhat better? Well, yes. What I'm proposing here is that when the user wants to create this client certificate or have it be signed, we're going to encrypt one of the two. Either encrypt the certificate request from the client, which is just a public key, essentially, or we will encrypt the certificate response from the server. As long as one of those two is encrypted and the man in the middle does not know the key, this process cannot complete by a fraudulent entity misrepresenting the client. Now, which process is followed exactly, I had to depend on the browser, because the public key generation, while it's in your browsers and underused, is not 100% absolutely compatible between all of them and how it behaves. So the general process is that the client is going to generate an RSA key pair. There's a keygen tag. It's been around since the 90s. It's just finally getting greater attention in HTML5 and being standardized. What that does is part of an HTML form. When the form is submitted, your browser creates an RSA private key, stores the private key somewhere locally, never reveals it, puts the public key in the form submission. Your server receives this. Based on that public key, it can generate a certificate. And that's basically what I'm doing here with one addition. I'm going to encrypt one of those two, the request or the response, using a key, and I'm going to deliver it out of band so that the man-in-the-middle device cannot see it. I have an example website that's going to do this, and I'll go ahead and demonstrate it. So my site is mutual.securityevaluators.com over HTTPS. What's going to happen when we go there? Well, I have a second subdomain that requires mutual authentication, while this domain does not. So the very first thing it's going to do is to try and request something from that other domain. If it fails, you must not have a certificate. The handshake failed. And we'll put you in the enrollment process to get one. So I have a brief explanation here. I'm using email as the out-of-band channel for this example. In reality, you would want to use something more secure. I think the best you could do is some kind of dedicated mobile application that does mutual authentication or a custom certificate authority for the server. We'll put in an email address. I put in a CAPTCHA here just to try to resist some easy automated attacks. Now, what just happened? The server generated this out-of-band key and it has emailed it to me. Then it wants me to choose my browser. It also works in Internet Explorer, but slightly differently. There's an ActiveX control. It's more complicated to generate the request and receive this response, but it's certainly doable. So I'm going to select my browser. If you saw that dialog that just popped up briefly and then went away, I didn't generate that. That was Firefox saying generating an RSA key pair. What I've done here is I've already submitted that key to the server, but the server is only going to respond with an encrypted certificate to try and stop the interception device from fraudulently going through this process. So I need the key to decrypt the response on the client side. I have this 128-bit key. You could still get some level of protection with a smaller key because this would be very cumbersome to type. Submit this. It's going to, on the client side, decrypt that response that it has already obtained and install the certificate in the browser. And that's exactly what happens. This is another dialog generated by Firefox. Once this is done, the certificate is now loaded in my browser. This is not a real certificate authority. Instead, it's just this particular server running one to authenticate the client. When we try to go to this other subdomain now, www.mutual.security-evaluators.com, it requires a certificate. Our browser says, hey, the server just asked for a certificate. You have one signed by the CA at once. Do you want to use it? Yes. And then I've redirected to here. The server can see what kind of certificate you authenticated with, and in this case, it now knows your identity. I've bound the certificate to your email address. A real server could act accordingly and maybe allow you to bypass security questions or let you get the functionality in the site that you can't access without a certificate, and so on. So is this cumbersome? Yes. But the security measures being put in place by many websites are just as cumbersome, I would argue. Many of them have security questions if you're missing a cookie, security pictures. Some of them are requiring you to answer a text message with some kind of one-time key, an email with a one-time key, and so on. I say this is not that much more difficult for the level of protection that it provides. So, do we have some questions? Or do you want to try out the site? Yes, in the back. Right, so say he was asking, would you ever need to revoke the certificate? There's no good way to revoke it for any third party to try and verify it. But also, we're not warranting anything other than to ourselves, right? So if you revoked it on the server, and the server and certificate authority may be running on the same machine, hopefully not, but at least running by the same company, could check the revocation. You could revoke them automatically after a time period. Another question? Personally, I just set it up just to test it. I signed it for a year. But there's some different issues. So it depends on what you're trying to prevent. If you're just trying to prevent man in the middle, I don't know that the certificate ever needs to be renewed. Right? But if you are also in scope, say the device gets stolen and the key is on there, in that case, you might want to limit it to, say, 90 days. The issue is, and I think this is one of the reasons why client certificates are not particularly popular, if anything goes wrong with that handshake with the server, the browser is pretty much lost. It just gives you an error message. So it will be fairly difficult to recover automatically from certificate present but expired. Also, as you could see when I went into the preferences, the UI for dealing with certificates is not particularly user-friendly in a browser. That said, with the speed at which browser innovations are happening right now, I think if this got popular, you'd see changes very quickly. So it all boils down to trying to prevent the interception device from getting its certificate on your behalf. And even if that would happen, I think it will be far more detectable than the interception without a client certificate. Any more questions? If you want to go ahead and try it out when you get a chance, maybe you'll find functionality on there that you might find applicable to one of your own sites. If this gets popular, then I think the internet would be a better place. All right, thank you.